For an exclusive event live from the Emmanuel Centre where we'll be trying to answer the very vexed question, was Thatcherism good for Britain? Go to unherd.com/live to watch the debate as it happens. You'll only get the first 15 minutes unless you're a subscriber, so go to unherd.com/live and become part of the UnHerd family.
Yes! Woo! Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special UnHerd debate. It was 100 years ago on the day that Margaret Hilda Roberts, as she was born in Grantham, Lincolnshire. She would have been 100 years old today, and her legacy remains as contested and as divisive as it ever was. We know that she was the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century, the first female Prime Minister, and you go to somewhere like the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, as I was a couple of weeks ago, and they have there encased her clothing, almost like a medieval pilgrimage, that almost by touching it, you might touch her sainthood. She is present still today. So we thought, let's settle the question. And let's settle it today. Was she the trailblazer, the hero who turned Britain around? It was struggling, and her handbag-wielding, tank-climbing, union-busting energy was what was necessary. Or was she someone who set in motion all of those years ago the seeds of the disquiet and trouble that we are now experiencing today? Well, let's find out. Before, ladies and gentlemen, I bring our all-star panelists to the stage, there are a couple of announcements. One of them is that, very sadly, Tim Montgomery, who was going to lead the case for the proposition, has been waylaid and it will not be attending this evening. However, such is the advantage of us now being in a small, happy family with other publications, including The Spectator, that I placed a call to His Lordship Michael Gove, the longest-serving cabinet minister of the last 100 years. He is currently hot-footing it on the tube to come and replace Tim Montgomery tonight, which I think is incredibly sporting of him. The second factual or practical detail is that we will be taking a vote before and a vote afterwards. If you've seen, there are these QR codes on the little screens. If you know how QR codes work, you can just open your camera, film it, and it will take you to an address. You can also just go to unherd.com/Thatcher if you want, and that will take you to the same poll. And what we want to do is just test it, first of all. So can we try, you see, we're getting people voting already. We've had 28. This seems to be working very well. The old adage that Marmite, you either love it or hate it, does not appear to be true, because quite a few of our audience are choosing neither. This is the technology we are going to be using to take the temperature before and after. Okay, now you've had your chance. I'm going to bring our debaters to the stage. We have assembled a panel that represents a very wide spectrum of opinions, and as you will see, they don't necessarily even agree with each other on the two sides. But I see that Lord Gove is present in the wing. So first of all, to propose the motion, we have the IEA writer and commentator Reem Ibrahim and former cabinet minister, now editor of The Spectator, Michael Gove. Thank you. Just to oppose the motion, we have one of the most famous writers and talkers we have, the person for whom there is no opinion too awkward, Peter Hitchens, and joining him, someone who has had an incredible journey in her career, from Marxism Today all the way to the Daily Telegraph. It's Suzanne Moore.
Hey. Thank you. Here?
Yeah.
Hi.
So, to open the debate, I have the honor of inviting to the stage Reem Ibrahim.
good evening. What a fantastic and full room. It's so great to see you all this evening. And on Margaret Thatcher's 100th birthday. How wonderful. So...
I'm so sorry, Reem.
Yes.
I'm going to have to interrupt you because we haven't taken the pre-vote.
Oh.
That was entirely my error. Someone just messaged me. Let's do the pre-vote. Stay right where you are, friends. Let's have the new poll on the screen. You can go to the same QR code. Oh, no, skip this one. This is a bit of live market research that we thought would be quite useful. Here we go. Thatcherism was good for Britain is the motion. And you can choose agree, disagree, or undecided. I should say that the measure of success this evening is not an absolute victory in this poll. It is whether you have moved the needle in each direction. So we will take the same poll at the end, and I suppose it is inevitable that those people who chose to come on a cold autumnal day to talk about Margaret Thatcher will tend to be in the supportive camp. We shall see whether they are more or less numerous at the end. So the results, I'm going to give it, let's go back to the result. The results for before, with 123 of you having voted, 60.98, so 61% are in favour of the motion that Thatcherism was good for Britain, 17% disagree, and 22% are undecided. With apologies for the interruption,
That's okay.
Reem Ibrahim.
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, it's fantastic to see everybody here this evening when we are celebrating and marking 100 years since the birth of Margaret Thatcher. Now, I would like to argue that Thatcherism was a rescue plan for a country in decline. We can't really discuss what Thatcherism was for Britain until we really talk about what it looks like in the 1970s. Now, I wasn't around in the 1970s, but I do recall looking at so many different books and thinking about what it was actually like, and we could transform it. But if you just step out in 2025, you'll have a pretty good idea of what the 1970s was really like. So, the 29th of April 1975, the Wall Street Journal ran an article entitled, "Goodbye, Great Britain." We had rubbish piled high, we had trade unions out of control, we had fundamental decline in this great country. And part of it was the large expansion of the welfare state and the large expansion of the government's control in your lives. Now, from the Institute of Economic Affairs, I'd like to focus a little bit on the economics, but also talk a bit about what this meant for the country as a whole. So, public spending as a proportion of GDP was at 60%. 60% of the economy was the government. That's 40% of the government being the productive, the private sector, where people are able to actually work and be able to make a profit, and 60% of that being taken in taxation and being spent by the state, without your consent, of course. Now, we had the standard income tax rate at 52%. The highest top rate of income tax was at 83%, making Britain one of the most uncompetitive countries in Europe. We also had the slowest economic growth in all of Europe, and yet in the 1980s, we managed to get to be the fastest in Europe, bar Spain, who started in a much worse position than we did. So with a 3-day week, we had strikes, we had bins piling high, we had huge amounts of despair. And then came 1979, where it had all just gotten to effectively a breaking point, the winter of discontent, in which thousands of people across the country really realized what was going on and began to discover that it was actually the government's fundamental fault. So, we come to the 1980s, where Margaret Thatcher has spent some time in office, and what did she do? How did she turn Britain down this road to serfdom into a path to prosperity? Well, she did so by fundamentally understanding that the size of the state was far too big, and that that productive part of the economy is where you are actually able to get wealth. A country country becomes prosperous not by the government, but by businesses, by individuals, by every single person in the country being able to work and create value. And she spoke about this in the terms popular capitalism. And I think that this is really, really quite fantastic, because effectively what she was saying is the free market, voluntary exchange in which every single one of us in the country is able to make the decision about where our own money goes without some government bureaucrat telling us to. So, I want to talk a little bit about the telecommunications as one example of where privatization, the mass selling off of the state, actually really worked. It was illegal to connect privately made telephones to state monopolies until 1982, which, as a Gen Zer with my iPhone, is absolutely shocking to me. The push button and the cordless made it de facto illegal, and the state underinvested in those exchanges, meaning that it didn't have those modern equipment for dialing. So privatization meant that you had that innovation, you had that technological advancement, and fundamentally people were actually able to invest in those companies should they choose to. It became a normal thing for everyday people to buy shares, and actually what that meant is people could have a stake in society. We also saw the size of the state, the sort of public spending as a proportion of GDP, go down to about 30% by the end of the 1980s. Again, meaning that people actually were able to keep more of what they earned. Taxation was able to be reduced. Public spending overall didn't go down that much, actually, when you think about it over the 11 years. But what did happen is that we actually saw economic growth. Economic growth. That word is often used quite frequently in 2025, and yet it seems as though no politician knows how to actually achieve it. So I've spoken at length about the economy and how she turned things around, but I also want to talk about what that meant for Britain on a global stage.
30 seconds.
I've been to the Falkland... Oh, that's my timer. I've been to the Falkland Islands. I went earlier this year, and I cannot emphasize enough what that meant for the Falkland Islanders, who are, by the way, I think, understand Britain more than we do in some respect. And what that meant is it was a symbol for what Great Britain really was. Whilst we were in decline in the 1970s and Argentina thought they could get away with taking over what was rightfully ours, Thatcher, as Prime Minister, was able to turn things around and really return to what Britain really was, which is a great, great country.
Reem Ibrahim, thank you so much. I am going to be quite militant about the 5-minute rule. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Suzanne Moore.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I've got Peter on my side, so I imagine he's going to do a hardline Marxist deconstruction of the Thatcher era. Although he won't tell me what he's doing, because that's where team spirit is at this point. So I'm just going to give you the soft-left perspective. But there was nothing soft about that era. Thatcher may have pumped extra air into the ice cream to make it cheaper and more fluffy, but there was nothing about Thatcher that was not hard-edged and hard-nosed. This was a brutal and destructive and immensely cruel time. Thatcher was very dark. So my reaction to her, as you can see, like many people of my generation, is visceral. I think we still live with the damage that she did to this country. What do I mean by Thatcherism? Well, she didn't invent it, Keith Joseph did. And when I worked at Marxism Today, people like Stuart Hall started to talk about the theory of it. And that we could understand that times have changed. Subculturally, we could see that we were in a post-Fordist economy, and that clothes, advertising, music was reflecting a need for aspiration. So, as Reem said, there was a stagnation in the 70s, and the unions had become powerful. There was post-imperial decline, and here was Thatcher, all va-va-voom, especially when she lowered her voice, and she would come and she would ignite the Big Bang. She would make the City of London the finance centre. She would sell off all our national assets. She would devastate the unions. She would deregulate the markets, and the markets became not popular capitalism, but a religion. So Thatcherism was a mix of petty bourgeois ideology. The market was good, elitism was good, individualism was good, the state was bad, law and order was good, patriotism was good, trade unions were bad, permissiveness was bad, women's liberation was bad. So we have a right-wing laissez-faire economic strategy with a reactionary authoritarian populism. Sound familiar? What did this mean? It meant that many of us on the left did not understand this at first, because she was transgressive. She was the wrong sex and class, and I will give her that. and she had an instinctive grasp of politics. She was one of our first feelings, not facts leaders. What she said, economics are the method, the object is to change the heart and soul. But how did she do that? She changed and she destroyed any sense of our collective capacity, and she replaced it with a lot of nasty selfishness. Individualism was celebrated, loads of money, the fantasy of wealth trickling down did not happen. The rich got rich, the poor got poorer. When I came home in 1981 from hitching around Europe, I saw homeless people sleeping on the street for the first time in London because she had removed the benefits of a generation. I'm not going to go with the whole Elvis Costello tramp the dirt down thing. It's not my thing. I much prefer the Adrian Mole's poem, "Do you weep like a sad willow on your Marks and Spencer's pillow?" That's what he wrote there. The lasting damages there. The miners' strike was this country's last civil war, and I will never forget it. It was about breaking up whole communities. We still import coal, obviously. The police were bussed all over the country to break up the heads of working men. Was that a small estate? I don't think so. When I went up and interviewed these people, the miners, they described themselves as retired undefeated. But loss was everywhere. Deindustrialization did not mean that more jobs came in. It meant that heroin came in. It meant expensive stereo shops came in for their redundancy payments. So she deindustrialized in the name of financialization, and these were the left behinds. She bribed many by letting people buy their council houses, but she didn't build any more, and this is part of the housing crisis that we still live with today. She sold off British Gas, remember Tell Sid? She basically asset stripped the country. She sold privatisation as liberation, but it was division. And a discourse of deserving and undeserving poor and Victorian values came into play. Cameron would later pick that up with the austerity narrative. Being poor is no longer about having no money. Being poor is a moral failure. Having voted for the decriminalisation of homosexuality, she brought in the dreadful Section 28. She pulled up the ladder for women behind her. She did not put down the ladder. She promoted just one as a junior minister. She was the exception that proved the rule. There was a lot of Freudian speculation about her handbag. Just what did she keep in that purse? She was able to conjure chaos and threat in her peripheral vision, our peripheral vision. The enemy was suddenly the Falklands. None of us have ever heard of the Falklands before that. The enemy was the miners with the Yorkshire Stalin of Arthur Scargill. The only thing that she did was good was she produced a fine oppositional culture in the 80s, with the exception of Billy Bragg. Her greatest achievement, she once said, was Tony Blair. What she did was break the post-war consensus, but she broke much more. She was a zealot.
30 seconds.
Okay. Thatcherism was not about deindustrialization, it was a form of demoralization. This country lost the idea that the working man or the working woman could ever really win again. But who am I to argue with a great man like Peter Mandelson, or with his judgment? He said, in 2002, we are all Thatcherites. I say, no, some of us aren't, because we haven't had our hearts and soul ripped out. Thatcherism was not good for Britain.
Suzanne Moore, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, this is fun.
And now, with a total time to prepare of 12 minutes, Michael Gove.
Thatcherism works. Half an hour ago, I was literally unemployed. Now, I have been put to useful work. Half an hour ago, those who are ready to talk this country down were in a majority. Now, we're fighting back. Half an hour ago, one inspirational lady in blue was prepared to stand up for free markets. Now, the tide has turned. Thatcherism is back, and it's winning. It was Winston Churchill who said that the greatest virtue in politics, without which all other virtues are meaningless, is courage. And I want to salute the opposition's courage this evening, because both Suzanne and Peter were Marxists in their youth. Peter famously, notoriously you might say, was a Trotskyist when he was a young man. Suzanne, of course, was one of the many brilliant writers who graced the pages of Marxism today. But now they find themselves in conservative circles and in the pages of conservative newspapers. Why? Because the facts of life are conservative. And no one embodied those facts of life or political courage more than Margaret Thatcher. Over the summer, I took Ream's advice, and I read about the 1970s. I read a brilliant book by the historian Dominic Sandbrook, one of the co-presenters of The Rest is History. It's a book called Seasons in the Sun. It describes Britain in the 1970s, and the situation was so dark, literally dark, because of the 3-day week and the strikes that afflicted our energy supplies, that this country was deemed to be ungovernable. On the right, threats of coups. On the left, trade unions who were insisting on wage demands that inflation ran at above 20%. That meant that for those who saved and for those who strove, their hard work was literally taken from them every day by an economy that no longer worked for working people and by a system that was betraying our democratic traditions. It was Margaret Thatcher who in 1979 set that process in reverse. Yes, tough decisions had to be taken, but unless those decisions had been taken, then Britain would have been in decline. As Ream pointed out, in 1975, our friends in the United States thought that Britain was gone forever. But it was thanks to Margaret Thatcher and what she achieved in her 11 years in power that we were able, alongside the United States, to show that free markets, free enterprise, and free speech could revitalize any nation. And we also stood for freedom against its most indomitable foe, Soviet communism, and saw that communism defeated. Now, when Margaret Thatcher came to power, in fact, even before that, she was derided as shrill, irrelevant, someone who traded in housewife economics. She told the country, you simply cannot spend what you have not earned. 364 economists, the experts of their day, wrote to the Times denouncing her budget in 1981, saying that it would be ruinous. But she stayed the course. The lady was not for turning. The basic housewife economics that she enunciated actually ensured that Britain was restored to economic health, that we saw re-employment, we saw the growth of which Ream spoke, and that growth wasn't restricted to a narrow and selfish few. I was in Liverpool just 2 weeks ago for the Labour Party conference. Visit the Albert Docks, visit that miracle of urban regeneration. Go to Canary Wharf, see the ground that was once left, muddied, broken, and completely bereft of hope. And in both of those areas which never voted and probably will never vote Conservative, you saw what free enterprise and a government committed to ensuring that Britain stands tall on the world stage could achieve. And she never stood taller, as Ream reminded us, than when fascism attempted to ensure that British subjects and British citizens were oppressed by a regime for which they had not voted and which did not have their best interests in heart. The war in the Falklands in 1982 was an attempt by a literal fascist dictator to not just erode British sovereignty, but to say to the West, you're slack, you're weak, you cannot stand up for the democracy that you seek to proclaim. And Margaret Thatcher, notwithstanding the temporizing of our erstwhile European allies, notwithstanding even the lukewarm support that she received from the United States, sent a task force in order to ensure that democracy would prevail. A country that since Suez had regarded itself as continually in retreat was at last able to roll back not just the frontiers of the state at home, but the frontiers of tyranny abroad. And that victory laid the groundwork for the victory in 1989 and 1990 that saw the Berlin Wall fall, millions liberated, and Margaret Thatcher vindicated. That is why Thatcherism succeeded. That is why Britain should be proud of the lady. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Really good.
To follow that and to set out the second case for the opposition, Peter Hitchens.
Good evening. What do you mean by good? And leaving aside the fact that during my researches for this evening, I discovered that Margaret Thatcher was an enthusiast for drinking skimmed milk. Much of what you believe, and indeed of what Michael believes about the Iron Lady, is fantasy. If only I had a Victorian thing called an epidioscope, I could here project to you this picture of Mrs. Thatcher during the 1975 Common Market referendum, wearing a jumper with the flags of all the Common Market countries, urging the nation to stay in the European Union. Or I could drag up for you the 1961 speech to her constituency, lasting 2 hours, a Fidel Castro event in which she explained to her constituents that's what she wanted the country to join and why, and understood wholly at the time the key issue of sovereignty. You might also look at the fact that when she was Education Secretary under Edward Heath, she did nothing. I mean, 2 parts of damn all. Thank you so much. If anybody couldn't hear me already, you can now hear me twice. 2 parts of damn all, let's be specific about it, to reverse the destruction of the state grammar schools, which were at the time the only way in which the children of the poor could get a good education. Now, there is no way in which the children of the poor in this country can get a good education. She was Education Secretary in a Conservative government, and she did nothing about it. We've had the Falklands raised. Now, I come from a naval family. My father was familiar with the Falkland Islands in the 1930s. I was one of the few people in the country who knew where they were when they were attacked. What I also know is that in the years immediately before the fascist regime of General Galtieri in Argentina began to plan to seize the Falklands, Margaret Thatcher and her chosen Defense Secretary, John Nott, were busily getting rid of the Navy. And if they'd had another couple of years, they would have sold or scrapped the Invincible and the Hermes, the 2 crucial ships in the task force for recapturing the Falklands. The Falklands, ladies and gentlemen, were recaptured by the Royal Navy, which Margaret Thatcher had tried to sink, not by Margaret Thatcher. And once you're clear of that myth, you can then look again at her amazing economic policy. I also spent many of those years as a labor correspondent, and I watched the great industrial Ragnaroks, time after time, unions hurling themselves over the top and being mown down in hopeless strikes. Well, of course it is true that if you look at Britain now, it's very, very rare to see a strike by industrial workers. But do you know why this is? Is this because Margaret Thatcher came up with an immensely clever formula to stop people from going on strike? It's because all those industries in which people used to go on strike no longer exist. There is no, and the economy, we're told, the public sector was greatly reduced. We got rid of a steel industry and a coal industry. Now we have great legions of condom outreach workers and local government, I don't know what's, filling up the public sector to just the same extent. What is this good? What is this victory? And how is the country more conservative? What single socially or morally or politically conservative action did Margaret Thatcher ever take during her entire time in office? Not one. I have to say, I'd spent some time, I used to travel with her as a lowly political reporter on her less important foreign trips, so I came into contact with her. I hugely resented the attitude of the left towards her because they loathed her because she was lower middle class and because she was a woman. And it was snobbery, and it was anti-feminism that kept them going. These people who claimed to be so fantastically politically liberal and enlightened, they hated her for the worst possible reasons. I admired enormously her rise from the total ordinariness of the corner shop at Grantham to being Prime Minister. It was an admirable thing. No one can look at her personal career and not think this was somebody of enormous distinction. I don't deny any of that. But in terms of politics, in terms of economics, she was, if the Falklands had not come along, and if Admiral Leach had not rescued her from her own folly, she was on the verge of collapse. The alliance, the Social Democrat and Liberal alliance at the time was sweeping her away, during which time, I have to tell you, she got together with the General Secretary of the Labour Party and abandoned plans which would actually have greatly undermined and probably destroyed Labour fundraising, so saving the country for Tony Blair. This is the great Iron Lady, the woman who saved Britain for conservatism, except that she didn't. It's all a great wobbling blancmange of myth. None of it is true. Admirable person, useless politician. At the end of it, the country fantastically worse off than it was before. Privatization? Are you enjoying Thames Water? Was it really so good? I have to tell you, it's a hugely overrated thing. I myself would renationalize the railways properly, not half-heartedly as it's being done at the moment, tomorrow, though that wasn't her, that was John Major, the man she mistakenly created. Again, another sign of her lack of political nous. I'm sorry, this person is hugely, enormously overstated, overrated, and overpraised. In fact, it amounts to something like Thatcher-olatry. The time has come to end it. If you're a liberal, if you're a Blairite, I can even see why Suzanne might be in favor of her, but I cannot see why any conservative could ever be in favor of Margaret Thatcher or would defend her political memory. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well done, Peter.
We are now going to go in the same order through our debaters and give them a much shorter period of time just to respond, and you don't even need to stand up at the podium for this, respond to any thoughts or things that you've heard that you feel need addressing. So we'll start with you, Reem.
Okay. Thank you. So I just want to address the Thames Water privatisation point. Privatisation works when individuals, consumers, are able to have choice and there is competition between those firms. In water, we have had none of that. What the government did was they sold off organisations like Thames Water, whilst Ofwat, the government regulator, regulated absolutely every single thing that company did. And so because that company was moulded to the regulations of the state, there is no competition. So yes, Peter is right, that was a failure, but it wasn't a failure of competition, it was a failure of government regulation. The other point I just want to add about...
Point of information, who designed that regulation?
The government.
Exactly.
Yes, well, I would absolutely like the government to be smaller, and I would absolutely like the government to have less of its tentacles into the private sector. However, to say that Thames Water's failures are a failure of privatisation is fundamentally untrue. It is a failure of government overreach.
Okay, Reem, thank you for that. Suzanne, what that you've heard from the other speakers has most upset, enraged, or indeed enthralled you?
Well, I guess because I was trying to make the point about how divisive the cost of what Thatcher did. You're talking about privatisation being good. I'm interested in the privatisation of morality that went on culturally. So, for instance, I don't know if you remember Cecil Parkinson, who impregnated his secretary, and loads of those guys did all that stuff. At the same time, there was a real kind of, going on about single parents and trying to deprive people of benefit and all of that stuff. So I think she was part of the kind of general privatisation of morality. I would say in some ways very unchristian. I mean, one of her famous things about the Good Samaritan was that she said you could only have a Good Samaritan because he had money. So that was the way that you saw, the way that she saw everything. And I think that this was a sort of terrible thing to teach a generation of people that the only thing that mattered, it was like the price of everything, the value
Point
of
of
nothing.
information, if I may. I would like to challenge this idea that morality was somehow privatised. I'd probably argue that morality has always been a private matter. Morality comes from the individual. And so I'd like to ask, what changed between the 1960s, the 1970s, and when Thatcher came in 1979? What changed that made morality somehow private, but it was previously a state matter?
Because it just was about what you could pay for. But the other thing I wanted to say was one of the things that interested me is Peter's weird obsession with skimmed milk. What is wrong with skimmed milk, Peter?
I think we'll come to that.
Milk.
What is wrong with skimmed milk? It's bad for you.
Okay, thank you.
Whole milk!
But people think it's good for you.
I'm now going to give the microphone to Lord Gove.
Thank you.
Is that? Yes.
There we are. I think this microphone was state-owned. It's now been privatised. So the first thing to say is that Peter makes a very powerful point about semi-skimmed milk. I completely agree with him. Gold top is my
Is
favourite.
it skimmed or semi-skimmed? What do we?
No, or either.
Whole milk.
Full fat milk is the only way to go.
Full fat.
However, full
Unhomogenised.
fat Thatcherism made the difference to this country. So Peter makes the point about Margaret Thatcher's early support for the European Union, or the common market as it then was. But she was the person who was visionary enough in her Brew speech after the Single European Act to say that the development of the EU was such that we could no longer remain members. And I think that her view broadly reflected the majority in the country, which was that a trading arrangement with our close neighbours was a good thing, but a superstate, a bad one. And it was that capacity to be pragmatic, rooted in her training as a scientist, allied to her native patriotism, that also meant that on the environment, she was visionary. She was the person who, alone among world leaders, first rang the alarm bells on climate change and on nature depletion, oft forgotten, but important to stress, that she was someone who always looked at the bigger picture, and looking at the bigger picture when it comes to privatization. Yes, of course, Thames Water has let us down, but at the time that Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, it was the case that the government even owned pubs in Carlisle. The reach of the state was so extensive that it needed to be pruned back, and that was the only way in which we ensured that we actually had a competitive economy. And Peter makes the point, of course, that our industry has, relative to 1979, has fewer people, our industries have relatively fewer people working in them. But overall, the rate of employment has risen, and more particularly, the number of strikes and the crippling ability of trade unions to hold the country to ransom has gone. And that's because of the trade union legislation, and in particular, her defeat of Arthur Scargill, someone who's receiving money directly from Moscow in order to overturn the democratically elected prime minister of that time. So of course we can lament some of the economic changes that globalization has wrought, but let's not for a moment take anything away from the achievements of someone who at every point believed in this country's innate greatness and was determined to ensure that the British people would get the change they voted for.
Thank you, Michael. Peter Hitchens.
Yeah. Couple of things. Somebody mentioned Christianity. Margaret Thatcher in 1968 was among those Conservative MPs who opposed one of the biggest social changes this country has undergone in the past century, the Divorce Law Reform Act, which actually created, in effect, no-fault divorce in this country, and has been a great delight for many adults and an absolute misery for millions of children who've lived with the consequences of it. She didn't like it, but she did nothing, again, when she was in office, either between 1970 and 1974, or when she was Prime Minister, to do anything at all to moderate that piece of legislation. The other things, Michael mentioned the pubs in Carlisle. It is true that vestigially, the government did own some pubs in Carlisle. I think around about that time it also owned a rather fine restaurant in the basement of the Tate Gallery. These were not crucial to the issue of state control versus privatization. They were a hangover of what I believe to be a very noble effort in this country to control the appalling levels of drinking, which was so socially destructive, and in which Lloyd George took advantage of the First World War to control by legislation which included nationalization of the pubs in Carlisle, but also actually led to much, much, much less drinking, much, much, much less domestic violence, and an enormous social change for the better, which the Thatcher government in the 1980s dismantled, not as a result of any kind of popular will, presumably because it was being lobbied by the kind of people who want to sell more booze. On Saturday night, I was stranded in the fine city of Reading, home of an excellent copy of the Bayeux Tapestry. I was stranded there thanks to the privatized railway company, which had decided that the train I was going on would go somewhere else, so I couldn't go there. And I walked around the centre of Reading on Saturday evening about 9 o'clock, and every single pub had at least 2 very large bouncers at the door. The amount of violence and unhappiness and distress created by that stupid, unconservative piece of action should never be forgotten, nor should be her attack on the Sunday trading laws, which protected many, many families and many, many individuals from being forced to work on Sundays, which they now, in many cases, have to do. That was another of her conservative actions. She was not a conservative. Yes, she had achievements beyond doubt, but they weren't conservative achievements, and they weren't good achievements. They didn't make the country better than it was before she started.
What is a conservative?
Oh, I think that's going to might have to wait.
The
for another
preservation of the good and the trusted, the opposition to unnecessary and foolish change, fundamental principles of conservatism, which she did in no case follow.
So there you have it, Thatcher, not conservative enough for
Not
Peter
conservative
Hitchens.
at all.
Not conservative at all. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to invite you in to this debate now. If we can have a little bit more light, we're going to take questions from you. If you have them, please raise your hand and someone will come round with a microphone. Please ask a question rather than giving a 5-minute diatribe. I will be very militant about this. I'm afraid I will interrupt you if it goes on too long. And please, phrases that end in questions are welcome. We're going to take them in little batches, and then I'm going to ask each side, just one person from each side, to take the question they found most interesting and most inspiring. So not all of these questions will necessarily be asked, but it is part of the Thatcherite spirit of competition to see if you can ask interesting ones. So, ladies and gentlemen, where is the microphone? There's a young lady in the aisle. There's a gentleman here, about halfway up on the left, who has his hand up. And then there's a lady two in front of him. Well, let's start with those. We will try and get all the way around the room.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Freddie, Stefan from YouGov Old Days here. Good to see you. I guess my question is for Peter. If we drop the nomenclature of conservatism, and we say that Thatcherism is an unusual form of conservatism, it doesn't dispute the point of this debate, which is that she was good for Britain. So,
okay, fair enough. Good point. We'll see what he has to say about that. And the lady just two in front of you. Yes, if you raise your hand.
Hello. I have just a simple question. Why, notwithstanding Margaret Thatcher,
If you're seeing me now, that means you've come to the end of your 15-minute free preview of this live event from the Emmanuel Centre. If you want to watch the rest of the event and catch up what you missed, go to unherd.com/live.